Okay. Welcome to today's hearing into the inquiry into the long-term sustainability and future of the timber and forest products industry. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament sits. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which my colleagues are joining today, as well as all people participating in today's hearing. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people who may be present today. Today's hearing is the committee's first and is being conducted as a fully virtual hearing. This enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of members, witnesses and staff. As we break new ground with the technology, I would ask for everyone's patience through any technical difficulties we may encounter today. If participants lose their internet connection and are disconnected from the virtual hearing, they are asked to rejoin the hearing by using the same link as provided by the committee secretariat. Today we'll be hearing from organisations representing the timber industry and various environmental groups. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearing. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you may make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry's terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. Today's proceedings are being streamed live and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify whose questions are directed to, and try to ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking. Could everyone please mute their microphones when they are not speaking? And please remember to turn your microphones back on when you are getting ready to speak. If you start speaking while muted, please start your question or answer again so it can be recorded in the transcript. Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. And I remind members and witnesses to speak directly into the microphone and avoid making comments when your head is turned away. So we now welcome our first witnesses. We each state our name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation. And I will start with who is in front of me on the top screen. Mr. Coppett, would you first state your name, position, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
That's better. My name is Stuart Coppock. I'm a consultant to Timber New South Wales. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, Mr. Dobbins. I'm just going on the order of the screen.
My name's Steve Dobbins. I'm Vice President of Timber New South Wales. I'm a forest scientist, used to work with Forest Corporation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Graw?
Sue Graw, Chief Executive Officer of Australian Forest Products Association, New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Ms. McCaskill? Marie, you're just on mute.
Sorry. Marie McCaskill, Chief Executive Officer, Timber New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, would either of you like to make a short opening statement, starting with Timber New South Wales and then with the Australian Forest Products Association?
Yes, Sue, did you want to start first, or would you happy for me to go first?
Happy for you to go first, Marie.
Okay. Timber New South Wales has been in existence since 1906 in its previous entities, starting out as the Country Sawmillers Association. It currently represents over 50 companies, plus as about 15 or 20 landholders and consultants who are working in the forest industries. It covers an enormous range of forestry operatives in New South Wales and different forest types. It's there to promote the sustainable forest management and sustainable forest products and the processing. It currently, as an industry, adds about 2.4 billion in value adding to New South Wales, and its export contribution is about 219.5 million. And as a regional employer, largely it represents about 22,000 people. So it is a very important industry. It's key to a supply chain that you now are seeing squeezed in the construction industry. And the industry itself believes that we are sustainable, we can supply really good quality sustainable products, and where possible for good environmental reasons, the supply chain should source its products from Australia. So I think that probably says enough for Timber New South Wales, because we have got a long and comprehensive submission.
Sorry, Sue, do you have a short opening statement as well?
Sue Grohl, thank you, Chair. This parliamentary inquiry is welcomed by AFPA New South Wales. We're the new peak industry body looking after the entire supply chain, from seed to trees to the products that we all love and use in New South Wales every day. This includes timber for house frames, as well as decking and doors, and also wood fibre products like cardboard and packaging. An assessment of sustainability needs to move beyond the long and divisive history to recognise a few things. The long and complex supply chain driven by a growing demand for our products, Marie touched on a little bit, the distinct contribution of our softwood and hardwood sectors, the services the entire industry provides, including bushfire management and delivering essential products. This was especially relevant during COVID. For example, all those vaccinations that are going around the country and the state are in cardboard boxes manufactured by our industry. And also, lastly, the environmental benefits that our industry brings, and that includes fighting climate change. It's really important to emphasise that our industry and environmental benefits are not mutually exclusive. Just very quickly, our top two recommendations for this inquiry are the need to build sovereign capability through expansion of plantations and farm forestry, as well as maintaining regrowth native forestry. Just a very quick stat, there's a soon to be published AFPA study that indicates that by 2035 there will be a cumulative shortage of about 50,000 house frames just in New South Wales. And for some scale, that's equivalent to 2 lots of Wagga Wagga. And this will require joint commitment to establish new tree plantings and achieve the 1 billion trees goal, as well as we also need some short to medium term measures to ease the shortage. And secondly, in terms of recommendations for the inquiry, an acknowledgement of the industry's role in fighting climate change. I think this is a really great opportunity for a shared vision for New South Wales forests. It also highlights the role of our pulp and paper sector, and it also is an opportunity for the industry to improve the way that we tell our stories and our benefits. So to paraphrase, I think we need to look at the future of timber and wood products in the state. And when I say we, I'm thinking industry, government, independent researchers, and the broader community that use and love our products. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And we'll throw straight to questions, which we start with the opposition.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks. Can I just ask, it's a question for both of you, and thank you for your submissions. Thank you for attending virtually today, and I know the committee appreciates it. There's a number of aspects that I want to explore during this inquiry, but the first one is regarding the plantation estate. Do we have sufficient plantation softwood and hardwood in New South Wales to meet supply going forward, say for 20, 30 years? Maybe Ms McCaskill could start.
Yes, and then I'll throw to Steve and maybe Sue, because Sue largely represents the vast majority of the softwood plantation operators. I've got a couple, but we are much more steeped in hardwood and native hardwood. No, there isn't sufficient. And I think in hardwood terms, what you've got to understand is that you can have hardwood plantations and they can produce quite good product, but the high appearance grade, real quality product that you see in flooring, etc., comes from the native forestry estate, which produces naturally really good quality timber, and plantation tends not to be at quite the same quality. So depending upon, Mr. Veach, what product you're asking for will depend upon the sort of plantation regime. Definitely for construction, definitely for frame and truss. There is an acute shortage of plantation, and post-fire, you've seen, roughly 40% of the plantation estate impacted by fire. And that's, people forget, you can't just say, well, we will just switch to plantations. It's going to take 25 years for softwood, 35 to 40 years for hardwood. I mean, Steve, you might wish to comment.
Yeah, the short answer is no. We didn't have enough plantation prior to Black Summer. We certainly don't have enough plantation now. That's both softwood and hardwood. There was already a need for softwood expansion in the Tumbarumba area. There are plantations currently around New South Wales in softwood, which I'm glad to hear last week they're looking to be repositioned rather than go to export to places where they're in greater need. Because if you think about the statistics of the softwood plantation, for instance, after Black Summer, we had a 40% loss of plantation. If you think that a plantation for a softwood through to clearfall is 35 to 40 years, and you've lost 40% of your plantation, there's a fair gap that's emerging. They've certainly done a fair bit of salvage harvesting over the last 18 months, but that's finished. So we already had a shortfall. We're heading towards a huge cliff, and smoothing that out without repositioning logs around the countryside, which will require haulage assistance to do so, is going to be a very difficult situation for some businesses, and certainly the communities that those businesses support. That's particularly the case around the Tumbarumba area. In the hardwood sector, we certainly don't have enough. One of the challenges for the hardwood or for any plantation industry is to have markets for the residue products for first thinnings. You need to have a market to get rid of first thinnings to allow the better quality stems to continue on and grow. In New South Wales, we don't have, apart from Eden, much of a hardwood residue market, and there's a fair bit of resistance from certain sectors as to increasing biomass production, etc., which would be a source feed for plantation thinnings. But no, we don't have enough hardwood plantations, and as Marie touched on, they don't produce the durable, high quality furniture type timbers, stairs, feature beams, etc., that regrowth forests can produce. But on the flip side of that, as we've seen with the Tarkeith example up around Dorrigo, Bellingen, a plantation can be perceived to be as good as a native forest. The locals in that area, the environmental groups in that area, are objecting to the harvesting of what was plantation on old dairy farms because they perceive those plantations, hardwood plantations, to be the equivalent of native forest.
Yep.
Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Thank you. My next question before I throw over to my colleague, Mr. Primrose, it relates to, I think you may have touched on it, Ms. McCaskill, in your opening statement. You talked about supply chain costs. Now, just some comments, and you may wish to take this on notice, but essentially, I'd love to get my head around just what are the supply chain costs for your industry from go to woe. So your haulage costs, all the input costs to your supply chain.
Thank you, Mr. Veitch. I might share this with my two colleagues as well, and Sue, if she wishes to make comment. I mean, haulage is an enormous cost. So you would have seen in the newspaper reports in the last week that they are going to send softwood from Walker, which normally would have gone to export, across to Oberon and some to Tumbarumba. The haulage costs for that will be enormous. And unless the government subsidises those haulage costs, and I don't believe, or my understanding is that they aren't, then that just increases exponentially the cost of the sawn timber. So it's an issue for a whole lot of the softwood processing companies at the moment, is how are they going to get sufficient supply throughput to keep being able to produce at the production levels they need to, and certainly how are they going to afford substantial haulage costs if it's got to come in from interstate because it can't be supplied domestically. For hardwood, it's always an issue because you will get hardwood supplies coming in from the mid-north coast to go down and supply people down in Cessnock. You will get people from Cessnock sometimes getting timber in from the far north coast. You get far north coast millers, and we're talking about Kyogle, Lismore, getting timber supplied to them from south of the mid-north coast. So it's substantial and it's problematic, and it's eventuated this way primarily because of the consistent closures and changes to the availability of state forests. And as the state forest estate has got smaller, then the distances having to be carted have got greater. The sawmilling industry in hardwood was basically historically established around regions. And that is why it was done that way, because it eliminated the need to truck and road haul long distance logs. So now what you're seeing is significantly longer distances, and with that, I might alert, becomes, despite the best efforts of the industry, you will get the potential for greater road damage and accidents.
Thank you. Over to Peter.
Yeah, Peter Primrose. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming today. My question is directed to all and any of you. It's concerning a quote on page 135 of Timber New South Wales submission, and it's a quote from Mr. Kevin Izard, Director, Frame Australia Conference and Exhibition. And on page 135, he says, this is in the second last paragraph of his quote, "My understanding is that large quantities of lower grade wood currently being exported to China and other Asian countries may be better utilised for manufacturing within Australia." I was wondering if you might be in a position to comment on that, please. Mr. Dobbins, I think, has his hand up.
Mr. Primrose, thank you. I guess you've got to look back at the history of the establishment of plantations around New South Wales. Post-war, there was a desire to establish plantations to be self-sufficient in pine, and the Forestry Commission at the time established trial plantings of plantations along the eastern seaboard in the tablelands. So you've got plantations established from Bombala in the south, right up through the Tumbarumba area, Oberon up to Walker in the north, and then you get into the northern pine up around Casino. So in trying to find the best place that these areas, the pine would grow, they've established reasonable sized plantation estates in those areas. Unfortunately, and a case in point would be Walker, you have a plantation estate of around 30,000 hectares, but you don't have which isn't big enough to support a international world class size industry. So you have a plantation there which is growing ahead, probably at the end of its rotation, but without a substantial industry there. McVickers from New Zealand tried to establish a mill there at Corindai. That failed. It's still up for sale. And those logs have, under Forest Corp's management, have been making their way through Newcastle to export. Same thing in Bombala, because of the haulage and supply chain cost of taking it from Bombala to Tumbarumba or to Bathurst, where industry is already established, is too high. So the opportunity for Forest Corp to manage those plantations, both their thinnings and also their subsequent clear for re-establishment, was to send those logs that didn't fit the existing industry down around Bombala. Forget what the name of the Korean company it is, Dongwon or something. All the softwood mills are very much like sausage factories. They can only take a certain size log. Anything too big, they can't go through the mill because the log never comes backwards. It always only keeps on going one way. Same thing with the logs that are too small. So if you don't have a fully integrated business or a fully integrated industry in the area that can take all sizes of logs, the logs that don't meet the size prescriptions for the mill or the mills in that area, the only natural place for them to go is either down the chipper or to export. And there's much better money sending them to export. So you do have these estates of plantations around, particularly softwood around New South Wales, where there isn't sufficient or a big enough industry to absorb it. And the only logical place for it to go is to go to export.
So is he correct or not correct when he says that it would be better utilised for manufacturing within Australia?
You're going to run into the same issue of size. There's only some of those logs of a particular size that are going to be able to fit through the mills that he is talking and referring to. We will see some of those logs, for instance, from Walker going to, as Marie said, to Tumut and to Bathurst, but they will only be taking the logs there that fit the size dimensions required by those industries. Anything else would need to be repositioned to another mill that takes logs of those dimensions.
Is there a sufficient quantity involved that this is a matter that this committee should be looking at more closely?
I think the issue that you've got a wall or a cliff that industry in Tumut, Tumbarumba, and as a result of backfilling out of Bathurst Oberon, there is a shortage of pine, full stop. There is an imminent cliff emerging after the salvage harvesting material has been utilised, and this committee should be looking at not only establishing and expanding plantation estate in softwood and hardwood, but they also should be looking at how can we help those communities, those businesses that those communities rely on to survive the 20 odd years that they are facing with a shortfall of timber. And so Sue's probably someone that should have a say on this one too.
Can I just make a comment that the question we had previously about supply chain costs, Mr. Primrose, sits squarely in your question. It's a very complex issue. Steve has touched upon the capacity of mills to deal with timber. That's got to do with investment. And if you're going to change that, it's big investments. So you've got to have a right environment to try and achieve that outcome. There's huge problems in that, which we can explore later if you wish to. Marie's touched upon the haulage costs, which in trying to deal with this timber, to deal with the problem in Australia, in New South Wales with softwood, is also a consideration. And then on the supply chain end, you've got the other end where Steve talks about there is a cliff, and the cost of importing timber to fix that hole up in construction for quite a number of decades now. That is what you've got to sit down and work out on an economic basis as to whether the investment and stuff and what you've got to do. It's quite complex. And to answer your question, that statement is correct if you believe in Australian manufacturing.
Okay. Thank you. That's my question. I think my time's just about up anyway. Yep.
It is, Mr. Primrose. I will throw to Mr. Field.
Oh, excuse me, Chair. Sorry.
Yes,
sorry,
yes, sir.
I didn't get a chance to address those first two questions to Mr. Beach. And I would echo a lot of what the other speakers have said. So in the interest of time, I'd like to take that question on notice because there is some upcoming information. There's a briefing note, for example, about the timber shortage. And as I alluded to before, a study being released tomorrow. So I'd like to take that question on notice so I can provide that information to the inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That'll be great.
Over to you. Just to be clarified, I take both of those questions on notice in the interest of time, as well as Mr. Primrose.
Yep, sure. Thank you. I'll throw to Mr. Field now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everyone for your attendance today. And this is one to start with that you might like to take on notice, both organisations. In your submissions, there are different numbers in terms of jobs identified, economic value of the industry, volume of timber. For example, in one submission, 22,000 jobs identified, in another 21,000. The economic value difference is more stark, 2.4 billion versus 7 billion. And there's even a difference presented in the volume of saw logs, 5.6 million versus 4.1. Could you take on notice, perhaps, in the interest of time, maybe collaborating or coming back to us with some clarity around where the numbers have come from, what the source of those numbers are, and exactly what they're referring to. And in particular, if you can, a breakdown in direct and indirect jobs and economic value, and also a breakdown between softwood and hardwood. Trying to get some certainty around the numbers, I think, is something is important for the inquiry to establish. Thank you. Could I ask, and this might be for AFPA in the first instance, what is the percentage for a new house build of softwood versus hardwood that goes into a average house build?
Thanks, Mr. Field. I'm going to have to take that one on notice. I've only been in this position for a couple of months, but it is something that we're working on. As I said, we've done a study on the upcoming softwood supply cliff, and part of that is looking at, an average house. So, for example, those numbers that I'm talking about, house frames, there's an equation behind that. We're looking at getting a similar equation for hardwood. It is a little bit tricky on the hardwood space, but an indication of how many trees it takes to build a house frame, how many hardwood trees you need to include all those components of a house. So it is something that we're looking at. So happy to take that on notice.
That would be great. And this is probably for either organisation. What would be really handy, and there's some mention in the submissions, but a lot of it is national level statistics coming from ABARES. If there's a way of getting a New South Wales breakdown on what channel, both in the hardwood and softwood sector, sort of the various products are, like, what percentage of the hardwood sector is going to poles and piles, decking and flooring, other presentation timbers, furniture, or pulp uses or other fibre uses. And if there's a similar breakdown available in softwood, though I know it's probably a bit clearer where that's going, that would be really useful for us to understand. And maybe just a direct question to Ms. McCaskill. You mentioned before in the discussion about plantations, the limitations of plantations for those really high quality timbers, that they tend to grow better in a native forest setting. Do you know offhand what percentage of the hardwood sector goes to those high quality presentation timbers?
I'll share this also with Steve Dobbins. A fair proportion of the high end, it depends on what you classify as high end. So if you're talking about high quality timber flooring, spotted gum flooring, black flooring, etc., then a fair proportion of the native timber that comes from those species goes into that. You get a slightly lower quality, depending again on the customer, for decking, but you get some customers that want very high quality decking timbers as well. But cabinetry and appearance grade things, certainly there's quite a high level of demand for that. At the moment, we can't supply enough for the demand that exists.
Can I ask what percentage of, and this I've got very limited time, so I might, most of that's on notice, and I appreciate that. Moving on to where your timber's coming from, Ms. McCaskill, what percentage of your members' timbers are being supplied currently from the private native forestry sector?
I think there's roughly about a third, or would be maybe less than a third of volume would be coming from private native forestry. Private native forestry has quite significant limitations. Steve Dobbins works almost exclusively in private native forestry, so I might ask him to make a comment.
Well, all my customers, Justin, come from private, but there was some work done by DPI a couple of years ago, DPI Forestry, about the private native estate and what proportion of volume came from that. So we will take it on notice, and we will forward the committee the reports from DPIE, which actually give an indication as to what sort of volumes were coming off private property. Because it is such a fragmented side of the industry, it has been very difficult to quantify. There was a time when Forestry Commission collected statistics from private property, and mills had to complete returns to have a mill license, but those days are long gone, probably 2 decades ago. So the statistics for the current day aren't being collected by anyone, and certainly no government agency has been doing it.
I do note that, though we did just get slightly different answers there. I think Mr. Castle mentioned maybe a third. You said all your customers. Maybe we could just clarify exactly what you mean there in on notice. That would be useful. And also whether or not that has increased since the fires, whether there's been more reliance on PNF. And I'll just foreshadow another supplementary that I'll put in writing, which will be, I'm interested as to whether or not DPI is actually facilitating the relationship between private forestry and the mills.
Thank you. That's your time now expired, Justin. So I've just got a few questions, and I think they may be to you, Mr. Coppett, about the wood supply agreements, but feel free to pass them on to others if you need to. So picking up on your submission regarding wood supply agreements, do the wood supply agreements owned and operated by Boral contain any, I guess, preference clauses that aren't found in other wood supply agreements with native forest timber sawmillers?
Yes, they do.
Okay. Can you elaborate on what some of those preference?
Yes, they were done in 2 parts. One was done under Bob Carr as Premier originally, and there was a slight preference given to Boral, but the big issue was done by the current government, where Boral, through one of their contracts, wood supply contracts, will take 80% of the cut of blackbutt off the north coast. In that particular clause, there is a floor under blackbutt and a couple other species, so that when it gets down to a certain level of cut, that is total harvest, if it goes below that, they take all of the blackbutt. So on certain species, i.e. the Premier species, which goes into the top quality floorboards, they have a floor under their quantity specified in the contract, which acts to the detriment of the rest of the industry. In the last lot of amendments, they actually have a ceiling on the poor quality timber. So what is generally regarded as poor quality timber comes off New England tablelands. So no one really wants that because there has traditionally been no market for it at the top end of the market. And so Boral had a ceiling put on how much they would take of that. So we, when we being Timber New South Wales, eventually found out about these clauses, we managed to get data for our members. We sat down and did 2 lots of serious analysis of the data. And it is clear, no business is the same amongst our members in what timber they take, even though they all operate under the same wood supply agreement. But you can see the impact of what was traditionally known as run of the bush being destroyed by these preference clauses. It is possible it's possible on modelling, and I understand the problems in modelling. On current timber supply, and if there are continued natural disasters, that we will get to the point where the floor will operate so that no other businesses will get blackbutt. Some businesses currently are not getting spotted gum because I think of these measures. We haven't seen Boral's data because we're not entitled to see it, but you can extrapolate out what we've done, just what the impact of the change of the methodology of supplying timber out of the bush through this contract mechanism. It's quite serious. I personally think, looking at the data, that actually goes back even to field management of the resource itself, because run of the bush is an environmental measure. If you destroy it, you start having other things happening.
Okay, so it would be fair to say from your comments that these preference clauses have given Boral a competitive edge.
No doubt. In fact, I think I can say that I had, in course of my research, not that people would come forward and sign an affidavit, that the market was saying that Boral was going to be the only supplier. That was being said to people in the marketplace. Only go to Boral. They're the ones with the timber supply.
It's on the other front is that Boral also control log distribution on the North Coast through North Haul, which is a company that basically brought together three major haulage companies on the North Coast, and Boral's staff sit at the top of that and manage North Haul. So they've got, on one hand, the preference deal, which gives them preference of all the good species and limits the amount of the poor quality species, and they also control the distribution.
Okay, thank you. I've only got about 2 minutes left, so I will foreshadow some of these will come as supplementary. But in 2018, the government announced, I think, $7.2 million in the budget to DPI for cross-tenure forest monitoring, and it was allocated to DPI Forest Science, who did a trial. Does Timber New South Wales or the AFPA have any commentary on that program and its outcomes? I'll maybe start with you, Marie, or Mr. Dobbins.
I might flick this one to Steve. He's been monitoring this very carefully.
When the $7.2 million was announced under the forestry industry roadmap, we were told it was going to be put to the side and not touched as part of IFOA monitoring. At the same time, or soon after the forest industry roadmap was released, the coastal IFOA, or integrated forest operation approval, was finalised and negotiated between Forest Corp and EPA. Under that coastal IFOA, there are normal monitoring conditions. Those monitoring conditions, you could argue, are business as usual requirements of the IFOA. But since the roadmap announcement of the $7.2 million, the control of the project, which was DPI Forestry's to run, was usurped by the NRC with the assistance of OEH and EPA. And basically the focus of the cross-tenure monitoring wasn't cross-tenure, it became looking at just what was happening in the coastal IFOA area, so just what was happening on the state forest. So the issue with the cross-tenure monitoring is we have this presumption that we can put things into a national park, lock the gate, throw away the key, and it'll be right. But no one really knows. No one really knows where that investment that we make, and most recently that the National Parks Estate requires $850 million or $121 a hectare to manage for the 7 million hectares that they manage. State forests cost $9 a hectare to manage of government or state coffers contribution through community service obligations. So making sure that we know that we're spending the money wisely by knowing what's going on in the National Park Estate in comparison to what's going on the other forested estate in the state forest seems to be a fairly good starting point to monitor and to actively and adaptively manage what you have. Are we making the right investment? So the cross-tenure monitoring program was essential, we believe, to firstly look at what was going on in the National Park Estate in comparison to the decisions we were making on the public state forest estate. So at this stage, the money's been diverted into business as usual projects. And here we are several years later, and we've seen no reports, no outputs from the cross-tenure monitoring. And all they've been looking at is what's happening on the state forest, not what's happening on the national park.
Okay. And my time has expired, but I just wanted to quickly throw to Sue whether she had any comments on that, and if she wants to take the majority of it on notice, I totally understand. 6 minutes is not really enough.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I will take it on notice. I just wanted to emphasise a few things just in broader terms, that I think there are different multi-use forests basically offer a whole range of services in addition to national parks. So I think going back to some of those points I made previously, environmental benefits like biodiversity are really important, but there's also quite a difference between the use of national parks and state forests. So recreation is a very quick example. There's a number of recreational activities and visitors to state forests that they can do in state forests that they can't do in national parks. So I think there's a lot more of a complementary approach. And as I said in the very beginning, I think we need to work in a unified way to better understand and to promote the benefits of those multi-use forests. And I think that is something that industry can get better at.
Thank you. I'm looking to opposition. Sorry, government. I'll throw to Mr. Farraway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. It's quite an interesting topic, all this. I wanted to direct my first question to Ms. Graw, and I wanted to actually follow on from the questioning from Mick Veach. So giving you the opportunity, obviously, rather than taking on notes, I actually wanted to hear what your answer was, even if it's only brief and you want to take more of the answer or notice. But if you could expand on Mr. Veach's questioning and also the supply chain, but also wanted you, if possible, at the same time, from the softwood industry's point of view, around the additional 270,000 tonnes of timber that would be entering the domestic supply chain from that announcement from the Deputy Premier on the 17th of September. And just what it meant to, obviously, in this instance, to the softwood timber industry.
Thanks, Mr. Farraway. It's probably worth repeating that, as I said, there is a study coming out tomorrow that indicates the cumulative shortage of 50,000 house frames. So that's a quick example of or demonstration of there's definitely a timber shortage. Sorry, there was a number of aspects to that question. In terms of a quick comment on the discussion that happened around freight and freight subsidies and haulage. A lot of those issues have been completely exacerbated by the fires. So normally there wouldn't be as much transport required from one end of the state to the other, but obviously the Black Summer bushfires have exacerbated that issue. Sorry, I've forgotten what else you asked. In relation to the movement from Walcott down to the southwest slopes, I'd really encourage the inquiry to have a look at the Softwoods Working Group paper as well. Even though they are based in the southwest, they give a very good overall picture of the softwood industry and some of the benefits that decision's made. They also point out a number of issues that are relevant to the entire state, including, as we have in our submission, some of the statistics around the growth in the plantation that's needed to better support that supply and demand issue.
Just following on, Ms. McGraw, the 270,000 tonnes, obviously you've got the transport and haulage costs, which, like in any supply and demand situation, is going to be exacerbated. I understand that. But in terms of the 270,000 tonnes, because of obviously the Chinese embargo and what has happened there, redirecting that 270,000 tonnes, I think it's over the next 3 years, back into the domestic market, what difference or how much of a difference will that make, I suppose, over the next few years to the industry?
Thanks. Yeah, the industry we put out a media release on behalf of industry welcoming that decision. It's important to emphasise that we are strongly supportive of any timber that's redirected into the domestic market. Don't remember the figure, but I can take that on notice. We did do a quick calculation of how many house frames that was roughly equivalent to, so I'm happy to provide that on notice. Yeah, it still leaves those operators in the southwest short, compared to what they're expecting pre the bushfires, but it certainly boosted supply into that region, and once again boosted supply into the housing and the construction market in New South Wales.
Moving on for a question for either organisation. Obviously, part of this inquiry, we are looking at a lot of the external influences and factors, obviously, on the industry as a whole. And drought, fire, water, and natural disasters are clearly one huge element to that. But there's lots of other, obviously, influences. We talk about, different governments and their regulatory structures. I suppose I'm just interested, from a federal point of view, what would be the top one or two federal regulatory structures or inhibitors or roadblocks that you're finding at the moment for your industry? And I'd probably throw it to Marie if you wanted to kick that one off.
Yeah, certainly. I think the EPPZ Act needs to have some fairly quick work done to it, because it's going to be exacerbated by opportunities to continually challenge the RFA status in each state. I think that's essential for the Commonwealth Government to address. One of the, I think, other issues that's often under the radar is, in fact, the national heavy vehicle regulations, because quite frequently what you see in a state like New South Wales is you have transport haulage companies having to do 200, 300, 400 kilometre diversions because local government won't allow certain weights across roads. So you have a real issue in road weights and haulage across the state, depending upon who's managing the roads. Similarly with bridges, right now you've got some councils that have lowered the bridge weights, which means that a B-double can't go across it, or sometimes a normal log truck can't go across it. And so you are adding to the costs by having to divert a whole lot of trucking. So we would probably like to see, and the Northeast New South Wales Forestry Hub is currently got the CSIRO engaged in a project to look at exactly that. What are the inhibitions and roadblocks to actually streamlining the management of roads and haulage, both from a safety point of view and from a economic point of view?
Ms McGraw, did you have anything to add, I suppose, with that from your organisation's point of view?
Thank you, Mr. Faraway. I would just like to add, in addition to the RFA issue that Marie's added, our two top and probably very topical points in terms of what pressure on Australian government or influencing their policies would be what I referred to before, the 1 billion trees plan. And secondly, what's commonly known as the water rule, which relates to the carbon farming initiative and emissions reduction farm. So it's been relaxed in 2 of the 4 New South Wales hubs, but my understanding is it doesn't include replanting following bushfires. So I think there's some work that needs to be done to remove some of these barriers.
If it's all right, I'll move on. I've got a question for Steve, Mr. Dobbins. It's around private native forestry, and obviously, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm certainly not an expert on the forestry industry, but my understanding is obviously private native forestry mostly takes place up the coast, obviously, and in and around the mid-north coast is quite a dominant area for private native forestry. In a lot of instances, when I've spoken to people that have private native forestry rights on their property, for a lot of them, it was their superannuation as well. Is that correct? In terms of their investment and that the ability to have private native forestry on their lot or on their land?
Yeah, the opportunity for private native forestry exists across the state, anywhere where the Local Land Services Act applies. So there are opportunities on the south coast and out west, just as they are on the north coast, but certainly private native forestry and those which operate within that arena is much more dominant on the north coast, and it has certainly been a greater requirement, if you like, on the north coast, particularly in that the north coast has historically had a fairly diverse and established timber industry, sawmilling industry in particular, and as a result of the regional forest agreements and the transfer of the public estate, a significant proportion of the public estate into conservation reserves, that industry has found itself looking more actively at private native forestry. certainly private native forestry tends to fit into two types of landowner. One's your traditional farmer, grazier, when beef cattle prices are down, which they aren't at the moment. They tend to look at their trees and say, well, I might be able to get a cut out of my trees. And they try to turn that over every 10, 15 years and basically get an operation going every 10 to 15 years, generally around what the market's doing for their other diversified agribusiness. The other sector are those which are basically moving out of the cities and trying to get a rural lifestyle. And they're ones that probably need a lot more attention in regards to education about private native forestry and the opportunities and how forestry should be done properly to have a sustainable resource going forward. Yes, they do look at their timber as a valuable asset, but that second type of landowner, the one that's freshly purchased a property, tend to be looking to try and pay off the mortgage that they've just acquired sooner rather than later. So they're the ones that potentially might want to step into private native forestry before the 10 to 15 year cycle is up. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. Just because my time's running out, I've just got a couple more questions. Firstly, we've seen in WA and in Victoria, obviously, the state governments there have a pretty hard stance on the hardwood timber industry or the future of it. I just wanted to see if you wanted to expand, obviously, on what is being done in different jurisdictions about sustainability and what those governments are doing, essentially, to the hardwood timber industry in those states.
Marie, do you want to lead off, or do you want me to have a crack?
I'll lead off broadly. Certainly, the Andrews government in Victoria has foreshadowed that by 2030, the native forest industry will be closed, and they will start having a progressive closure from 2025, as I understand. And then there was the shock decision in the last couple of weeks of the Western Australian government, after they had invested a lot of time and energy with the industry in working out a plan for the future for native forestry. They suddenly determined that there would be a complete shutdown, and it would be almost immediate. So the industry in those two states are reeling. I think the blowback from that is that people don't quite understand is that will mean there'll be greater reliance on importing hardwood timber in from other countries, and the logical places will be places like Malaysia and Indonesia and what have you, that often don't have the environmental credentials or certification processes anywhere near that match what would have been going on in WA and in Victoria.
We should be proud of the sustainable timber industries that we have. They are world class. They are world leading. They are accredited to international standards of sustainability through Forest Stewardship Council or PEFC. We should be proud of them. And it is in a generation where we're looking at climate change and solutions, growing trees and storing embedded carbon within products should be something we're holding up and as a torchlight for everyone to follow. What we shouldn't be doing is shutting down our native forests, in my view, and basically letting them grow to a single-aged, old-age state, which benefits some species but not all. A sustainable managed native forest where you have a mosaic of age classes and structures benefits the greatest majority of species than a single age class old growth forest or wilderness, which is suggested as the pinnacle. There is no climax forest in Australia. Man has been managing the ecology in Australia for 60 plus thousand years with the fire stick. And if we don't realise that, we're going to have more 2019, 2020 fires. We're going to have extinctions, which we've already seen in Western New South Wales from lack of fire. And we will see similar things in Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, where decisions have been made opposed to the science follow the science. The science suggests that sustainable managed native forest is best for the environment, best for carbon storage, best solution for climate change.
If I may add, when you talk about science, you need to be very careful where the science is coming from. A lot of the work comes out of Canada and Europe, and it is not Australian-based. And so when you start seeing reports as to saying that forestry needs to be stopped to protect the bush, you need to scratch down and find out what the modelling is, where the assumptions come from, because most of the stuff all of the stuff you read in the press actually is based upon other models, not the Australian bush. And very few of these people, if any, have gone off their desk and gone out to the bush to see what Steve has just said about the need to have a mosaic-based forest structure across national parks and state forests, because national parks actually determine the health to a large extent of state forests. It's all one forest, and we don't have a all one forest policy. We do at the federal level, but New South Wales government decides not to, through its bureaucrats, decides not to follow it. And offline I can take you to the reports that clearly show that the structure was put in place under John Howard a long time ago through the RFA agreements, and what's in the legislation at the federal level simply does not happen at the state levels. And it's not just New South Wales. So the state of the forest reports, frankly, are just a wad of paper, wasted paper. And that's another discussion. But the issue about Australian bush, they are unique. And you need to be very careful about what science you're looking at and not other issues and agendas which are running.
Thanks. I think my time's expired, Mr. Chair.
It has, but Sue, did you want to quickly just say something and then?
Thank you, Chair. I would like to take that questions on notice as well. We're doing quite a lot of work on carbon sequestration, but generally I would agree that without native regrowth forestry, you need to have a look at the consequences, and some of those consequences are missed opportunities in terms of fighting climate change.
Thank you. And look, that concludes our time, unfortunately, today. I think we probably could have had another hour and still probably not scratched the surface, but I do foreshadow that there will probably be a stack of supplementary questions coming from the committee, and you have taken some of these questions on notice. So the Secretary will be in touch with that list, and you will have 21 days to respond. But once again, thank you for attending virtually today and providing some great insight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panel.
Thank you. We will now break for a few minutes while there is that changeover. So if you'd like to mute and stop your video, that will be fine. Okay, so welcome back to section 2 of today's hearing into the long-term sustainability of the timber and forest products industry. We now have witnesses from the Nature Conservation Council and the Environmental Defenders Office with us. So welcome. We might just quickly do a sound check. So I might start with you, Mr. Smith. If you just take yourself on mute and just give us a level check.
Thanks, Mr. Benaziak. It's Dr. Brad Smith here from the Nature Conservation Council.
Thank you. And Miss Loanne?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Sarah Loan
Yes.
from the Environmental Defenders Office.
Thank you. And Chris Gambian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris Gambian, Nature Conservation Council.
Thank you. And Miss Wormsley?
Thank you. It's Rachel Wormsley from the Environmental Defenders Office.
Excellent. All right. Well, we might start by taking oaths or affirmations and then proceeding with any opening statements. So in that same order, Mr. Smith, did you want to state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation?
Could you just come back to me while I find the affirmation card?
Yep, sure, no worries. We might start with you then, Miss Loanne. Loan.
Sarah Loan. I'm a senior solicitor with the Environmental Defenders Office. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Gambian.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Chris Gambian, Chief Executive, Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. And Miss Wormsley.
Thank you. Rachel Wormsley, the Head of Policy and Law Reform at the Environmental Defenders Office. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And back to you, Mr. Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Brad Smith, Campaigns Director at the Nature Conservation Council. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Now, starting with the Nature Conservation Council, did either of you want to make a short opening statement?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, I will. And thank you to the committee for the opportunity to say a few words this morning. I first acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the land of the Bidjigal people in the south of Sydney on the northern banks of the Georges River. I pay my respects to ancestors and elders. 2 years and 2 weeks ago, I travelled to the headwaters of the Kalang River, just west of Coffs Harbour. It's an extraordinary country that is home to some of the best flora and fauna New South Wales has to offer. It is koala country. I saw scratch marks and found scats myself. The Kalang River is home to the endangered snapping turtle. Logging compartments had been identified in the Kalang forest, and logging operations had already started to cause considerable damage to the forest and to the river. A week later, the first of what would become the worst fires in recorded history broke out not too far down the road from where I'd been. Fires of that summer of 2019 will live in the memories of all of us here for the rest of our lives, no doubt about that. They changed everything. You don't need to be a greenie to understand that when over 5 million hectares of forest in New South Wales is burned, when an estimated 3 billion animals perish, that the balance of ecosystems have changed fundamentally. What was true before the fires is simply not true now. You don't need to be a greenie to accept that pragmatic economic reality, native forest logging does not stack up financially, and that more money can be delivered to the people of New South Wales by keeping trees in the ground. We can have a bigger, more viable and much more sustainable timber industry in New South Wales with the right policy framework. But any such policy framework must see us transition away from native forest logging as soon as possible. Both Victoria and Western Australia have set such a course in recent times. With good transition packages that ensure no one is left behind, they have started the much needed process of protecting what's left of the Australian bush and the species that depend on it. There are few better gifts we can leave the next generation of Australians. Most of the work in the timber industry in New South Wales is in the softwood plantation sector. These plantations should continue to be the way in which we harvest timber, and the plantation estate should be expanded to ensure that we can meet our long-term hardwood timber needs. The conservation movement in New South Wales has no interest in exporting a conservation problem to other states or to the forests of other countries. We want to work constructively in New South Wales to ensure that our irreplaceable biodiversity can thrive, whilst a well-designed and managed plantation sector delivers good quality timber, as well as good, well-paid, safe and secure jobs for regional New South Wales. Early in 2020, with the bush still smouldering, New South Wales Forestry Corp set about to recommence logging operations across the state. Nothing could have been more reckless for the animals and other species that depend on those forests, species on which we in turn depend. You only need to look at the mouse plague in Western New South Wales to see what happens when habitat is destroyed and the balance of ecosystems is lost. Everything in nature plays a role as part of an intricate system that serves us all. Forestry Corp have not been responsible stewards of our native bushland. They've been prosecuted multiple times for causing irreparable damage to the bush that is in their care, but which belongs to all of the people of New South Wales. The future of the timber industry should belong to those who are able to respect the ecosystems in which they work. In recent weeks, there have been some wild proposals to create new biofuel industries that would see forests burn for energy. Billed as forest waste, their claim is that this industry somehow represents a step forward for environmental management. It does not. In an era when we face a climate emergency and we have an urgent need to reduce carbon emissions entering the atmosphere, nothing could be more foolish. Helping the bush to load onto a ship to Japan is not the best use of our precious landscape. This is not a time for crackpot schemes to enrich a tiny minority of industry players. This is a time for sensible, thoughtful policy making that serves not just our immediate interests, but the public interest for generations to come. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Someone from the Environmental Defenders Office, Ms. Lone or Ms. Walmsley?
Yes, we'd like to make an opening statement. And for those of you who don't know us, Environmental Defenders Office is a community legal centre specialising in public interest environmental law. We have a long history of providing legal advice in forestry issues and advocating for law reform to ensure laws protect the environment and that the community can properly participate in environmental decision-making, oversight and enforcement. We welcome this inquiry into the long-term sustainability of the timber and forest products industry. The inquiry is particularly important in the context of post-bushfire recovery and provides a critical opportunity to consider the future of the industry in the context of a dramatically changed landscape. We hope the inquiry can examine whether the legal framework regulating forestry operations is delivering its intended outcomes, including to achieve ecologically sustainable forest management. Consider the impacts of the devastating 2019-20 bushfire season and explore future opportunities for the management of the native forest estate and its use by the timber and forest products industry. As noted in our submission, our contribution has focused on the regulation of forestry operations being undertaken in native forests. We acknowledge that some issues, such as the value chain and supply chain and projections for softwood and hardwood supply and demand, are better addressed by other stakeholders. And I think you've heard from some of those this morning already. To that end, our submission to this inquiry focused on three key issues: the environmental impacts of and challenges facing the industry, limitations and weaknesses of the current regulatory regime, including following the bushfires, and future opportunities for the industry. Despite some recent improvements in relation to monitoring, compliance and enforcement, we have ongoing concerns about the impacts of the industry on native forests and the failures of the regulatory framework. Those concerns are set out in more detail in our submission, and for that reason I won't expand on them now, other than to say that from a legal perspective, the failings of the current regulatory regime mean that the overarching goal of ESFM, ecologically sustainable forest management, is not being achieved and is unlikely to be achievable under the current framework. And those concerns have only been heightened following the bushfires. For example, we are particularly concerned that even despite some site-specific operating conditions having been put in place temporarily, logging is essentially continuing business as usual under the coastal IFOA. And this is despite expert evidence commissioned by the EPA indicating that the normal coastal IFOA in the context of the wildfires will not deliver ecologically sustainable management as required under the objectives of the Forestry Act. The EPA itself, the regulator of the industry, has said that operating under the coastal IFOA at this time is not tenable. We're also concerned that the government is not publicly releasing independent advice it has received from the Natural Resources Commission on forestry operations under the Coastal IFOA in the aftermath of the bushfires. This advice is important to all stakeholders, particularly as we continue to engage in these discussions about the future of the industry and the future of our native forest estate. To address the significant concerns, we've made a number of key recommendations for consideration by this committee. Number one is that we recommend that forestry operations in native forests be suspended pending the outcome of the NRC advice. The process by which the NRC prepares its advice should be transparent, and that advice should be made public. The current legal framework for regulating forestry operations in native forests on public and private land must be revised to better align with the principles of ecologically sustainable forest management. IFOAs, in particular the Coastal IFOA, should be revised and updated to take into account the impacts of the 2019-20 bushfires. The government needs to finalise its private native forestry review, including reporting the outcomes of the review and its consultation on the draft code, and no changes should be made to the PNF code until that review is finalised. And finally, we recommend that this committee should examine the scientific and economic and environmental evidence as to the viability and sustainability of the forestry and timber products industry continuing to undertake forestry operations in native forests. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now just throw to the opposition, Mr. Veach.
Thanks, Chair. My question is to Mr. Gambian, and it's to do with his comments around plantations. As the committee would know, and others, on exploring this concept of hardwood plantation going forward for the sector. Mr. Gambian, what the importance of plantations not just being a monoculture? Can you talk through what you would see would be the appropriate, I guess, way to set up a hardwood plantation in New South Wales?
Yeah, happy to. Well, let me first of all say I'm not claiming to be an ecologist or have any sort of higher knowledge of these things, but in broad policy terms, I would say that absolutely support hardwood plantations. They do already exist to some extent around the place, and to some extent it has already been the practice of Forestry Corp within state forests to replant logged compartments as effectively plantations. That's caused problems. Don't get me wrong, that's caused problems. Monocultures absolutely are. Having the right diversity of species, having a thoughtful assessment of what's going to work in a particular context, and having a long-term management regime, critical. To some extent, we're seeing through these last fires the impact of the fires on the softwood plantation estate. Now, trees take a long time to grow, and hardwood takes even longer to grow than softwood. So thoughtful planning needs to be multiple decades long, not short term, and recognising that there will be fire events, there will be damage, and we've got to have a regular program of ensuring that there is constant planting so that we will continue to have that supply well into the future. One of the risks I would see would be to take a sort of haphazard approach with planting hardwood. There's a real opportunity here, I think, to look at degraded, already cleared land and actually lift environmental values, create an opportunity to store carbon while the trees are growing, and potentially for landholders an opportunity to make some money carbon markets, and potentially for the state to make money off carbon markets during the growth phase, and then to carefully manage those forests as a cycle. We could end up with a net overall improvement for nature, for climate, and for the timber industry.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just pick up your comments around the carbon market? Pretty keen to talk about this as well, and how the opportunities will arise, or how they present themselves, not just for the state with regard to carbon sequestration and accessing the carbon market, but also private native plantations. How do you see that regulatory framework incentivising such an action?
I might throw to Mr. Smith on this, because he's Dr. Smith, who knows these things far better than I do.
Okay.
Thanks. Brad Smith here from the Nature Conservation Council. The role for carbon farming, I think, has huge potential in Australia. The potential market is very large. And if you look at any of the scenario reports that groups like the IPCC put together and other international groups, there's a very large wedge of the climate solutions that are land carbon, so storing carbon in forests essentially is the main way to do it. So this is a huge opportunity, and I think New South Wales could see very large areas of the state dedicated to planting forests for carbon storage. And like you pointed out, Mr. Veach, ensuring that those forests also support biodiversity is very important. And there's those two factors support each other. So biodiverse old forests with large trees are more resilient forests, more resilient to pests, more resilient to fires, and so on. Whereas forests that have smaller trees, monocultures and so on can be much more vulnerable to those things. So as climate change gets worse, there's a risk that our carbon stores, our forests, are a danger from increased bushfires, a danger from pests and so on. So if we want to make sure that those carbon stores are resilient, then making sure they're biodiverse is really important. And similarly, we're also in a biodiversity crisis. Climate change is causing a decline for a lot of our species. So that's a really good opportunity to look after our biodiversity. So those two things can be mutually beneficial. I think when it comes to timber harvesting, that's now a third, I guess, aim that you might be throwing in there. And I think looking at the economics of that would be really important, because the way plantations are managed is much more intensively than native forests, of course, the way they're harvested and so on. And that improves the economics of plantations. And I think it's part of the reason why the Harwood division of Forestry Corporation is losing money, but the plantation division is not. And so I think weighing up those three different goals is really important. And perhaps I can see a really strong role for having forests that are managed for both carbon and biodiversity. Those two things seem very mutually beneficial. I think when it comes to timber harvesting, perhaps it's a different sort of regime.
Thank you. And the last question before I hand over to my colleague, Mr. Primrose, can I just ask then, are there jurisdictions in Australia doing this well, or would if New South Wales were to head down this policy path, they would become leaders? Is it an opportunity to become leaders?
I can quickly jump in with one example. So back in 1999, Peter Beattie in Queensland announced that Queensland would be moving away from native forest logging and put in place a 25-year transition strategy that relied on planting hardwood plantations. And that strategy has seen some success, although recently it's been upset. In 2012, the government in Queensland privatised the plantations. The planting regime wasn't followed through. And so now I think that they're in a bit of a pickle and sort of have gone off the track a bit there. So I think there's definitely things to learn from the Queensland experience in terms of the species that were used and the types of land that were successful for those hardwood plantations, but also some warnings that these programs need to be followed through. They need to be long-term programs.
Thank you. I'll hand over to Mr. Primrose.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one question, and it's addressed to all witnesses, anyone who'd like to answer it. On page 135 of the Timber New South Wales submission, if I could just read out one of their recommendations, and it's to do with harvesting again. And they say, with 88% of public forested land reserved from native timber harvesting operations have become concentrated in some areas. This has opened the government to criticism from local communities that it is supporting the intensification of harvesting, allowing timber harvesting to have a lighter touch across a larger area by integrating forestry with the management of forests more generally, along with clear communications campaigns would address many genuine community concerns. Such an approach could also help protect the forests from future catastrophic bushfires. For this to occur, the New South Wales government needs to discard its siloed approach to forest management and to embrace tenure-neutral principles. I was just wondering if anyone would like to comment on that, please.
I'll jump in on that, Mr. Primrose. First thing I would say is it is a complete misrepresentation of a logging operation to suggest that any kind of logging operation can be that is trying to create a metaphor that simply doesn't exist. The second thing I would say is that the consequences of the fires across Australia, across New South Wales in particular, was also tenure blind. and there have been devastating impacts across the entire forest estate, across New South Wales, public and private. Third thing I would say is we have a protected reserve network. These are lands that have been identified over generations by both parties in government as warranting special protection as part of a global standard of conservation that says there are some places that are so important they should be protected. Now, it's worth noting that since European settlement, huge portions of New South Wales have been cleared and continue to be cleared at a staggering rate. Only about 9% of New South Wales is actually protected. So this kind of self-serving spin from the industry that suggests that somehow they'll have better PR if they get to more places and just go more gently completely misrepresents what they're actually proposing.
Anyone else? Okay.
Also add to that. Sorry, I'll just add to that that we hear from a lot of people in these communities that have concerns about what's happening in their native forests, and I don't think that many of our clients or the people that we hear from would necessarily agree with that statement from Timber New South Wales.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Yep. I've just got one if our time's still there. If I could, again to Mr. Gambian, in your submission, Mr. Gambian, you talk about the adequate funding for the NRC. Can you just talk through why you think that is important and how you see the funding for the NRC would be applied by the would best be applied?
Well, I think the NRC have demonstrated that they are capable of providing proper assessments of some of these resource issues sort of thoughtful and objective way. So without sort of skin in the game, NRC is able to look at some of the science, make useful judgments. Ensuring that the NRC is properly funded to do that work, I think is critically important. It's worth noting that in the last state budget, the NRC was reduced, not increased. I would have thought in New South Wales, we have got so many questions that need to be balanced in terms of resource management. We should be looking to the NRC to do much more thoughtful and intelligent work around how we do maintain that balance. Now, this is not a time for ideologues. This shouldn't be sort of culture war whipped up at a political level, which often happens. But we need to rely on scientists and we need to rely on policy experts to get the settings exactly right.
Thank you. And that's the opposition time's expired. I'll throw to Mr. Field.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance today, both the organisations, and for your detailed submissions. In the last session, you may have been listening to it at the end, Timber New South Wales representatives in particular. I'm sorry I don't have the exact words. I was trying to have it transcribed to read them to you, but the essence of it was that a sustainably managed forest and managed with sustainable timber recovery is the best, provides the best for the majority of species. The indication was that there needed to be management through harvesting, thinning, and bushfire management to ensure the best outcome for the majority of species in a particular forest area. Could you perhaps, from the NCC in the first instance, provide a response to that?
I think it's extraordinary that anybody would think that human intervention in the forest is somehow going to produce better results, that Timber in New South Wales has it more right than God had it for millennia. But I would say that that simply doesn't stack up. There is no scientific evidence that suggests that to be the case. It's completely misleading to suggest otherwise.
I might add to that. It's Brad Smith from the Nature Conservation Council. Mr. Field, if you look at species that are in decline in New South Wales, and one example is the greater glider. a lot of the species that are threatened species rely on hollows in trees, and the regular harvesting of forests, where Forestry Corp goes in every 30 odd years and takes out the biggest trees, means that features of the forest, like hollows, are regularly taken out. The loggers want the biggest trees, the oldest trees, that are most likely to have hollows, and so does the wildlife. And so there are prescriptions that require Forestry Corp to maintain a certain number of hollows. That can be as low as 2 hollows per hectare, hollow-bearing trees, sorry, that is. But we have this competition between loggers and gliders. And if you look at the threatened species listing in the federal government's documents, you'll see that logging is listed as the #1 threat to gliders. So the idea that that logging somehow improves biodiversity or something, like, the opposite is very clearly true. There are many species that are under direct threat from.
Okay, and this also goes back to Timber New South Wales' submission, but something that you mentioned, Mr. Gambian, in your introductory remarks. Timber New South Wales has highlighted the role of forests in reducing carbon emissions, which is obvious. But one of the 5 points that they've listed here is bioenergy from wood waste replaces carbon-intensive fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas. And you mentioned there are some bioenergy proposals on the table at the moment in New South Wales. Could you just respond to and provide any evidence that you're aware of that bioenergy from wood waste can replace or is better than carbon-intensive fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to provide the references specifically on notice, but in general terms, the burning of timber for energy is more carbon intensive than burning coal. The idea that you can burn something within a matter of minutes or seconds that takes potentially 100 years or more to regrow completely gets wrong. The idea that somehow we've got a clean energy source or a carbon neutral energy source. It's simply not the case. I'm no ecologist, and I don't want to be representing myself as such, but you may burn the timber from a particular tree, but you kill the tree in the process. And so the root system, all of the other stores of carbon are suddenly no longer there for us. So these biofuel proposals that we've had in recent times, the most significant being around the Hunter and the possibility of reopening a woodchip terminal at the Port of Newcastle, would be absolutely devastating, because it would create a market for native timber from native forest, public native forests, that doesn't currently exist, for the purposes of burning it and putting more carbon into the atmosphere, exactly at a time when we need globally to reduce the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere, as well as the immeasurable biodiversity loss that we will get within those forests that have seen the increase in logging operations.
Thank you. Now, I've got very limited time. I might only get one more, and this is to the EDO, and I'll get you to decide who's best to answer it. You've made comment this morning and in your submission about the adequacy of the current regulatory framework with regards to ecologically sustainable forest management. Now, I know you've been following it closely, but the EPA last year wrote a pretty scathing letter to Forestry Corporation that suggested that they may well be outside of their Forestry Act responsibilities to comply with those principles. Can you just explain the basis of how we got here? How is it that the regulator is having to write letters like that, but seemingly no action has since happened? What does that say about the regulatory framework that we're operating in New South Wales to be able to manage, impacts on the forest such as the fires?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Field. Look, I think it highlights that some of the issues we've raised about the framework being difficult to enforce, that it hasn't been, that compliance and enforcement has been an issue for the framework for a long time. And I think that what we saw happen at the end of last year highlights that. As the regulator, the EPA has the role of ensuring that the Forest Corporation is complying with its conditions, and that's what it was doing at the end of last year. It was putting Forestry Corporation on notice that it was going to be watching closely its operations. We expect that that's what the EPA is doing, but at the end of the day, the framework, the conditions and the framework that are in place it has been poorly enforced in the past, and we expect that those are the issues that we're seeing moving forward into the future as well. We would say that we need to support the EPA to do its role properly. If it's finding that there's issues in terms of being able to enforce the conditions or enforce the rules that are in place, then we need to go back and have a look at those rules and see if we can tighten those and strengthen those. And we need to support the EPA to do its job properly to ensure that what's happening in our forests now, particularly post bushfires, is meeting ecologically sustainable forestry management. And if we're hearing from the EPA that they've got concerns that it's not, then together we need to go back and look at those rules, and we need to see if we can find a way moving forward that the framework as a whole is able to meet those objectives. And if it can't, then we really need to think about what we need to do with the regulatory framework. Rachel, did you want to add anything to that?
Okay, thank you. I think my time's expired.
It has. Thank you, Mr. Field. I might just start with the Nature Conservation Council. I sent through a document of a DPI study that was done, I think, from 2015 to 2018 on selective thinning and its ability to improve biodiversity. And I think it was done in the Pilliga, but I've also heard that they were doing some stuff on river red gums. And I guess perhaps on notice would the Dr. Brad Smith might have a look at that and give some comment as to whether there's a place for selective thinning of some forests in terms of improving biodiversity.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I saw that come through, and I'd be happy to provide some comment on notice. I suppose the first thing I would say is that that study was based in the Pilliga, in the white cypress pine forests out there. And those forests have been very heavily disturbed. Of course, cypress pine was, a sought after timber because it's termite resistant. So it's been heavily logged. Also, grazing of sheep, and I think feral rabbits had a big impact on those forests. So it's a very heavily disturbed forest, and I think the results of that study are interesting, but I would caution against applying those results to other forest types, especially forest types that are less disturbed. And it looked to me like the findings of that study were that trying to emulate old growth forests or native forests in terms of the forest structure was most beneficial to biodiversity, rather than thinning the whole lot or not thinning any of it, trying to get back to that sort of structure. So I think that's probably not a bad principle.
Okay, thank you. Jen, we just stick with you on this concept of carbon capture. Now, some of the stuff I've read sort of states that you don't really get carbon capture until about 10 years into a tree's life. And then I guess from a group or collective perspective, if we had a forest or a set of trees, it wouldn't really be truly effective until about 100 years. And then obviously that's not factoring in the loss of carbon when trees naturally rot or they're burnt in fire. And some of these studies have suggested that carbon capture using trees isn't probably the most effective way of doing so, and they've suggested other species like algae or hemp as far more effective. So I just wanted your thoughts on whether you can actually build, I guess, a carbon capture market around trees, given those studies.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There's definitely some important concerns that you raise, but in general, forested land does store a lot of carbon. To give you an example, for every ton of carbon that we emit, whether we're driving to the shops or using some power from fossil fuels, about half of that is absorbed by forests and oceans. So for free, those natural systems are storing half of the CO2 that we emit. So if we increase the amount of forested land, then we can increase the amount of carbon storage that's happening. Some of the concerns you raised around fire and things like that definitely need to be taken into account. So carbon is lost in those circumstances. But Australia's native forests, so there have been some very good studies done about the amount of carbon that they store in the East Coast forests of Australia. The potential for storage is huge. Like you said, when forests reach their climax, so they have very big trees with very big root systems, soil carbon builds up over time. Those forests store the maximum amount of carbon, so 100-year-old forests. But on the way there, of course, the forests store more and more carbon, each year as they get to that state. So there is a big potential there. Generally, forests that are managed for wood production store around 40% less carbon than old growth forests. That seems to be a general sort of average. Of course, it would go up or down depending on whether it's a temperate or a tropical forest and so on. But there is a huge potential for storing CO2 in forests. But I think you raise a really important point, which is that it can't necessarily compensate for carbon that comes out of the ground. So taking coal out of the ground and burning it is a one-way process. Storing carbon in a forest, it becomes part of a carbon cycle. That's called green carbon. And those two kinds of carbon aren't necessarily equal. So yeah, we should definitely be storing as much as we can. But at the same time, I think the idea that 1 ton of carbon stored in a forest is the same as the ton of carbon burnt from coal, that equation just doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. I've just got about 2 minutes left, so I might just throw one question to the Environmental Defenders Office. In your submission, you talked about that the current legal framework doesn't align with ESFM, but you particularly mentioned third-party enforcement rights and issues around that. Are there specific issues that you're talking about, or do you want to see an expansion of third-party enforcement rights to include other third parties? Is that what you're proposing?
What we were getting at there in our submission is the fact that our legal framework for forestry doesn't include third-party enforcement rights, and that's the ability for a member of the community or a third party to enforce breaches of the law. Now, third-party enforcement rights are a key feature in environmental legislation. You see it in other legislation that regulates other industries such as mining, planning, but we don't see it in the forestry legislation. I think it was removed sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. And what that does is it hinders the ability for the community and third parties to be involved in the environmental decision-making process and the enforcement of environmental laws. Now, while we've got the EPA as the regulator, sometimes forestry issues slip through the cracks. Sometimes local communities have good knowledge and good ability on the ground to identify key issues, and where the regulator is failing to do its job, having that safeguard of the community there, being able to prosecute in its own right its concerns in the courts against potential breaches of legislation is a key safeguard in environmental legislation. As I said, we see it in our laws in relation to other industries, but it's not here in the forestry space, and it's something that we say should be reinstated. It's just an additional safeguard, to ensure that the laws are being adequately complied with in order to achieve the objectives that we're trying to achieve, such as ESFM.
Okay, thank you. I think my time's expired, so I think I'll pass to Mr. Farraway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to some of the witnesses, welcome. We were floodplain harvesting last week, and we're forestry industry this week. My question to Mr. Gambian: do you believe that there is a climate crisis?
Yes, Mr. Farraway, of course I do.
And you would believe, I suspect, that we should use all the tools to reduce or sequester our emissions?
Well, what I think we need is thoughtful policy that looks at the best opportunities to reduce the amount of carbon that we are emitting in the first instance. Probably what we would describe as the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that we can do quickly and readily to significantly reduce emissions? And the government has got a pretty good track record on this in recent times in terms of the energy roadmap and ensuring that we transition away from our 5 polluting coal-fired power stations. The next piece of work will be ways in which we might reduce the existing carbon in the atmosphere and sequester more carbon. Of course, all of those have got to be weighed up, as all sensible public policy does, against the costs and the benefits.
So I take it, Mr. Gambin, you would
I didn't
believe
realise we're having an inquiry into climate change today, but I'm
no. Here's the question then. Do you believe, Mr. Gambin, that we should support industries, like native and plantation forestry that reduce emissions?
Well, I think our testimony today says that yes, we do. So we have told you this morning already numerous times that we would support the expansion of a hardwood estate, absolutely. And if farmers can make some money off growing trees because it sequesters carbon for a period and then can be sold as timber in the future, we've got no problem with that.
Okay, excellent. Moving on, do you believe that it is important that we reduce the travel miles for heavy products like timber in terms of haulage?
These are starting to get to be quite specific questions, Mr. Faraway. Why don't you cut to the chase and tell us what you're getting at, and then I can give you a complete answer.
Well, no, I've asked a question and I'll repeat it again. Is that, do you believe that it is important that we reduce the travel times for heavy products like timber?
I think reducing travel times for everything, including politicians getting to Macquarie Street and people catching the bus to school, is a good thing. I've got no problem with reducing travel times, but again, why don't you get to what you're trying to say?
Oh, well, I suppose we'll move on.
You an answer, so why don't you tell us what your answer is?
Well, excuse me. Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order, Mr. Chair. I'm asking some questions here and, looking for answers, and all I'm getting is questions back from the witness. I suppose here's a pointed question for you, Mr. Gambian. Do you have any imported timber products in your home?
I have absolutely no idea. I imagine, like everybody else in New South Wales, I probably do. If you're asking if I've got a beautiful redwood dining table or something like that, no, I don't. But my house was built in 1908. So I imagine there was all sorts of timber put into this house, including probably from what used to be hardwood forests around where I live. But again, I'm not that into the Socratic method. So if you've got something to say, why don't you just say it?
Do you have, I suppose, another good one for you, Mr. Gambian, then is, do you choose to have locally sourced timber products in your home? If they're not imported, do you choose to support locally sourced timber products?
I think you'd be surprised to learn that I don't buy that many timber products. But again, I'm not really the target of this inquiry. So if you've got something to say. Now, last week when we spoke on floodplain harvesting, I had to Google you after the inquiry because I didn't know who you were. I suppose.
Well, that's all right. You know who I am now. You know who I am. So moving on, Mr. Gambian.
Mr. Faraway, I'm renovating my home at the moment, so I might be able to help a little more on that question. And we have been using a lot of timber products in the renovation of our home, and it surprised me how many of them are pine products. All of the structural timber we've used has been pine. The builders and carpenters have brought into our house. Even the floorboards are Kauri pine, and the structural timbers, the joists, the beams, the lintels are all laminated veneered pine. And the reason that the builders are using pine is because it's more stable, it's easier to work with, it's lighter. I guess in terms of haulage, having less weight is also helpful. And so I think that really shows that the construction industry has changed a lot in the last few decades. And for the construction of houses, the amount of hardwood used in all of those uses that I laid out has been greatly reduced because of technology change, because the industry is becoming more productive and more efficient. Pine trees grow fast, they're much more economic. And I think that trend is only continuing. Even hardwood floors now made with plywood backing because it's more stable. So the industry is changing, and I think we see that in Forestry Corporation of New South Wales accounts, that it's lost money every year for the last 10 years in the hardwood division. And I think that really needs to be taken into account in the future of the timber industry in New South Wales, so that we have future focused industry that has adapted to that technological change.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So just going back to some of the, I think we had earlier questioning and some earlier commentary around extinctions. And Mr. Gambian, I suppose one again for you, if you so interested in Googling me. Do you know of how many extinctions have occurred on state forests? No. Or does the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales know that?
No, but I'm happy to take that on notice.
The answer's nil. would you be
Well, Mr. Farraway, we can save everybody a lot of time if you don't ask us questions you already know.
That's all right. He'll be asking the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gambian. So moving on, Mr. Gambian, would it surprise you to find that there has been a reintroduction of extinct species into national parks?
No, not especially.
Okay, and that actually came from state forests, my bad. So just was interested if the Nature Conservation Council were aware of that.
I mean, if you're asking if we support state forests, the answer is yes. We think they're fantastic. And we should.
The reintroduction of those extinct species you talk about. Did you, Mr. Gambian, did you know that plantations generally don't produce timber and that they can be used in products, many different products? And I suspect we were talking about houses before, and they may very well can see in the background of your video that, plantations can be used, generally don't produce that timber. So are you aware of that?
Sorry, Mr. Farraway, are you suggesting to me that plantation trees don't produce timber? Because I think that's going to come as a surprise to the trees.
No, they don't produce timber, generally don't produce timber that can be used in products that we can see perhaps what's in the back of your video there.
Well, I'm sure others have given you evidence on that. I don't have anything further to add.
So the last point, which is on the industry.
Mr. Farraway, I might be able to help with an answer to that question. So if you look at the ABARES statistics, around 90% of the wood products produced in New South Wales come from plantation sources. There's around 9% left that come from native forests. And I think that's the sort of the main interest that Nature Conservation Council has, is that 9%, because of the competition with native species and with the aims of our organisation in terms of conservation. But the other 91%, the great bulk of the timber products, comes already from plantations, and we fully support that.
Just moving on, I asked earlier of some stakeholder groups, in particular Timber New South Wales, about the hardwood timber industry and the fact that we've seen what was deemed a bit of a shock decision out of WA and a pre-existing decision, I think, out of Victoria to completely phase out the hardwood timber industry. Now, in New South Wales, there's obviously a lot of regional communities, a lot of supply chain. There's a great deal of jobs and economic activity that is surrounded with the timber industry more broadly. What's your opinion, Mr. Gambian? And also, obviously, I should ask the EDO as well on where to next. Do you support the complete banning of the hardwood timber industry in New South Wales?
Well, as we've said in both our submission and this morning, what we support is a thoughtful expansion of the hardwood plantation estate so that we can have a thriving industry. I don't think anybody in the hardwood timber industry in New South Wales, and I didn't see the testimony this morning from Timber New South Wales, but I'd be surprised if they said they were experiencing a thriving sector at present. Now, that is not to say that it couldn't be a thriving sector, and that is not to say that regional communities couldn't benefit quite substantially from thoughtful interventions into ensuring that those industries can be sustainable, both economically and ecologically, into the future. So we say there is definitely a role for government to play here to ensure that the hardwood timber industry can in fact be profitable. The stats of Forestry New South Wales alone demonstrate the limitations to that sector at the moment, and it's a sector in decline. There's no question of that. The New South Wales Treasury is exposed to extraordinary risk from timber supply contracts that it will most likely not be able to meet over the coming years. Now, good economic management says if you want to have a hardwood timber industry, and we say there is nothing wrong with that, there's nothing wrong with having a hardwood timber industry, then it should be an industry that is sustainable and based on plantations, as the rest of the timber industry in New South Wales is. This is not a state like other states in Australia where most of the timber work happens within state forests. A very small proportion of the timber industry exists in state forests at present. And we say we can have a much better timber industry in New South Wales, although I accept that we are not the experts in the economics of the timber industry by a long shot. But we say small businesses up and down the coast of New South Wales, regional towns can get a double benefit with thoughtful interventions. You can have hardwood timber in plantations you can raise the conservation value and the land value of degraded land. You can reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and you can have booming tourism businesses in state forests that can be converted. And the good example, of course, is the Great Koala National Park on the mid-north coast, but there are other examples through the state. Please don't try to characterise us as being against the timber industry. As I said in my testimony, we are ready and able to work constructively with the timber industry and all sides of politics in the New South Wales Parliament to ensure that we can have a sustainable industry, both economically and ecologically, into the future.
I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chair.
You are. Thank you. So that concludes our questioning of these witnesses, and we thank them for their time and their insight. I believe some questions were perhaps taken on notice, and the committee secretariat will be in touch, and you may also receive supplementary questions, because I don't think 45 minutes is enough time to explore the breadth of this issue with you. So we will be in touch, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the committee.
We will now have a short break while we change over. So I would encourage committee members to turn their videos off and turn themselves to mute. So welcome back to our last session today in the inquiry into the long-term sustainability and future of the timber and forest products industry. This session we have with us representatives from the World Wildlife Fund Australia, the Colong Foundation for Wilderness, and the National Parks Association of New South Wales. So starting with Dr. Stuart Blanche, can we first get a quick level check?
Hello, Mark. How are you going?
Can you just speak up a bit?
Is that better?
Yes, that is. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Excellent. Miss Virginia Young, can you just do a quick?
I can. Hello, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you. And Mr. Dunnett.
Hello.
Excellent. Awesome. All right. So that all sounds pretty clear. We'll start now with the taking of oaths or affirmations. So starting with you, Dr. Blanche, would you state your name, position, title, and swear either an oath or affirmation? And I believe the words have been emailed to you.
Yes, they are. Thank you. My name is Dr. Stuart Blanche, Senior Manager towards 2 billion trees with WWF Australia. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you. Miss Young?
Thank you. My name is Virginia Young. I'm one of the directors of the Colong Foundation for Wilderness. I'm also on the board of the Great Eastern Ranges Connectivity Conservation Initiative and work for the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society on a global research program funded through Griffith University on climate and biodiversity. So I will do the affirmation. I solemnly and sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Mr. Dunnett?
My name is Gary Dunnett. I'm the Executive Officer of the National Parks Association of New South Wales. And I swear that the evidence before me shall be the truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. And in that same order, would we like to give a short opening statement, and if possible, if we could keep it to maybe 1 to 2 minutes, that would be great.
Thank you. Stuart Blanche here. Thank you for the opportunity to provide evidence to this very important and timely inquiry. I think that New South Wales faces some key imperatives relevant to forests and the forestry sector. Protecting forests while increasing wood supplies, a green economic recovery following COVID and the bushfires, diverting public funds from degrading forests to growing plantations and restoring forests, managing forests as a globally significant carbon sink, and preparing for climate impacts. We think the solution is a fair and timely transition this decade out of industrial scale native forest logging and into a much expanded plantation estate or FSC certified logging sector. The Victorian and WA governments have shown this is possible and it's necessary, although it's difficult, particularly if not well consulted. Retailers and finance markets are increasingly removing carbon emissions and deforestation from supply chains. As climate impacts worsen, the already uneconomic native forest logging sector will further degrade forests and require expensive ongoing taxpayer subsidies. The New South Wales government and private sector should consider the many hundreds of millions of dollars needed for a fair transition to support logging contractors, mill operators, regional communities, farmers in this transition. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dunnett?
National Parks Association likewise believes that now is a pivotal time in the future of our state forests, and it's time for the transition from exploitative forestry to management of those lands for conservation purposes. The reason that we are so clear in that view is that the fundamental context of our state and our forests has changed so much in the last decade. I'm not going to reiterate everything we've put into our submission, but I'd make reference to the extreme level of land clearing we're seeing across all tenures in New South Wales under the significant changes to native vegetation laws in 2016, which leaves us in a situation where our Crown estate is becoming increasingly important as one of the last secure refugia for biodiversity. The accelerating understanding that native vegetation, and in particular vegetation communities that are in intact or as close to intact condition as possible, are our best possible means of sequestering carbon into the future. And of course, the extraordinary level of cross-subsidisation that's happening between the different sectors of the forestry industry at the moment are all amongst those factors which are telling us that it is time for change if we are to avoid not just global cataclysm, but also a extraordinary loss of the biodiversity values of our own state. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll throw to questions from the opposition, and I believe I'm going to Mr. Primrose.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just two questions, and it's to any witness who'd like to answer them. We heard this morning from Timber New South Wales, and I'll just quote from their recommendations on page 135. And one of their recommendations is, and I quote, to improve supply in the short and medium term, the most cost-effective opportunities reside within the native forest sector. At present, the New South Wales government has constrained supply more tightly than at any time in its 150-year history. The New South Wales government must loosen native timber supply constraints to allow opportunities for the timber industry, the construction industry, and the New South Wales economy. I was wondering if anyone would like to comment on that, please.
I might, but I noticed Virginia did not make a statement. If that was an oversight, just raising that. Just want to make sure Virginia has a chance.
Sure. Virginia, sorry about that. Did you want to make a quick opening statement and then we'll go back to that question?
Yes, thank you. I did, because I think I bring two perspectives to the inquiry. One is at the local level. I live in a village that was saved 3 times by wind changes in the summer of 2019 fires, and experienced firsthand the distress and terror for individuals, families, communities, and the devastation to wildlife and to forests. Since then, I've been involved in a number of science-based projects looking at post-bushfire forest recovery, and that's all been part of the sort of the voluntary work that I do. But one thing that struck me, and I did send some supplementary material through to the committee, is the vast outpouring of grief and care for trying to restore our forests and habitat and protect wildlife. So I think that's an important thing. When you think about who the community is, there are literally thousands of volunteers who are continuing to work to try to give wildlife a future in New South Wales. At the other end of the spectrum, I sent you a media release actually from the first ever joint workshop of the 2 science advisory bodies to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity was held in June this year. And you'll notice if you read that, the urgency of the call to deliver integrated action on climate change, to prevent climate change and further biodiversity loss. And their top priority in the actions that they've identified is protection and restoration of carbon and species-rich natural ecosystems like forests. So there are two, I guess those two perspectives are what have informed the Colong submission, and I guess the terrifying reality that a lot of the ecosystem services that our forests provide, and they go well beyond timber, their water regulation, their an equitable climate, obviously carbon storage and sequestration. Those ecosystem services are now at risk unless we change our approach to how we manage our native forests. So the Colong submission is very much focused on those changes and the need to I guess, I echo a lot of what Stuart had to say, refocus energy on a planted timber estate and focus management on the native forests, on restoration and recovery to ensure resilience, reduce fire risk, and improve the outlook for wildlife and communities as we face escalating climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. And I might just throw back to Mr. Primrose and just note that your time for questioning has restarted, so you haven't missed any time.
Oh, excellent. Well, I won't reiterate the question I just asked, and will. And to remind people, it was just about the recommendation to Timber New South Wales relating to the need to remove constraints in the native forest sector. So if anyone would like to answer.
Thank you. I think it's a great question you raise, and I understand Timber New South Wales' frustration. They can't get access to forests. The reality is they will never be able to get enough access to native forests now. Because of the impacts of climate, we'll have more reduction in wood supply agreement in the decades ahead. And as more species like koalas and greater gliders are listed as endangered under federal law, the New South Wales government will not have the ability to provide so much wood from the native forest estate. So I think at a time when there's some panic over what the future of the industry is, which I understand, and the future of our forests from a community point of view, I think it's really important for the inquiry to say, what is the long-term future, and do we make some hard decisions? And these are difficult, hard decisions, but I'll just point to these decisions have been made in other states, and there's a future ahead. What we don't want is a reduction in wood supply, because wood is a very important construction material that's low embodied energy, good for the climate if grown in plantations, but we need to plan it and invest in it. It's at least 20 years for softwood and probably 40 to 50 years for hardwood. So the longer we leave this transition in a clear policy agenda, the longer we delay investment in certainty for the forestry industry and certainty for those regional logging communities where I grew up. They will never have that certainty until the transition is completed. And there's no point saying we want to get back into our native forests when the fires have taken out so much of the wood supply, particularly on the south coast. There will never be an economic forestry industry there now. And I think Timber New South Wales asked an important question, but they've got the wrong answer in mind.
It's also not the only question, Stuart. So the question is, how do we improve the resilience of the forests for a whole range of ecosystem services that forests provide to millions of people in New South Wales? There are a lot of lives and livelihoods that are tied up in the decisions that this committee will make, not just a transition pathway or the future for the timber industry. Actually transitioning workers into other jobs is something the New South Wales government's done many times in the forestry industry, and as have governments elsewhere in Australia. It's not rocket science. So the big change is climate change and the interaction between climate change and past damage to our forests. And you will see in our submission a reference to the increased risk of fire and increased fire severity in younger forests. Now that's a major issue. The science on that is now clear, and you can find that on the website that I put in our submission, www.bushfirefacts.org, where a review of all the science literature on this issue has been undertaken. It's in report number 3. So there are many more questions to be asked by this committee, and not just the sort of the short-term needs of the timber industry. I totally agree with Stuart about, we want a viable, economically viable timber industry that can stand on its own 2 feet and not come at the expense of the ecosystem and services and our wildlife in our natural forests.
Thank you. Mr. Dunnett, do you have a comment on that recommendation?
No, I'm more than comfortable with what my colleagues have said. Yeah.
Okay. One of the many recommendations made by Timber New South Wales, and I asked this at the previous panel was, I quote, with 88% of the public forested land reserved from native timber harvesting operations have become concentrated in some local areas, this has opened the government to criticism from local communities that it is supporting the intensification of harvesting, allowing timber harvesting to have a lighter touch across a larger area by integrating forestry with the management of forests more generally, along with clear communications campaigns, would address many genuine community concerns. I mean, there's more to the recommendation, but I was wondering again if you would like to comment on that recommendation.
Yes. I would say I mean this in the nicest possible way. Like, I think they are barking up the wrong tree. They are never going to get access to a sustainable, viable industry and attract the private sector capital they need to expand wood supply if they keep focusing on native forests, because those forests are highly contested. And as long as we're in this cycle where we keep looking at how can we get access to more forests, and yet the government or communities won't let us into those forests, there'll never be a peace. And so the answer is we need to grow a lot more trees, and the best place to do it is on cleared land where there's a social license, where there's good investment near the mills, near the forestry nodes. It's not trying to get access to more native forests. They are too valuable for Australia and our state, particularly just for carbon storage. I just don't think any state government will, particularly next decade, will be able to have any native forest logging industry, because the treasuries of the states will see that they're too valuable as a carbon mitigation measure. And we should be paying communities to save that carbon whilst we transition.
Thank you.
The other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the national parks, which is, I assume, what this comment from Timber New South Wales is directed towards, are RFA parks. So quite a lot of young forest came into the park system during the RFAs and are still recovering. But it's a lot quicker to recover habitat in 20 to 30-year-old forests than it is from planting new trees. So separate this idea that there's somehow or other you can have your cake and eat it too in natural forest, I think is obviously still evident in the approach that's being taken by Timber New South Wales. It's surprising actually, because it is so much more economically attractive to plant and harvest trees that are purpose planted for a particular product. It's about 88% of Australia's wood already comes from plantations. It is really a nonsense to try and keep propping up an industry that's been in decline for a long time and has done a lot of damage to wildlife, our carbon storage, and other ecosystem services along the way, and now comes with increased fire risk and severity. So it truly is a pivotal time for change.
Thank you.
If I could just add, I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, what does future proofing look like in the context of a future forestry industry?
Yes.
And the component of that, as both Stuart and Virginia have said, is to think about where you do forestry in places that have the social license and aren't contested. Another component of it is to think about it in a landscape context. Where in a multi-use forest environment can anyone put their hand on their heart and say that in the conditions we know are coming through with climate change, that there is a low probability of a future wildfire event removing that resource? The only places that that is even vaguely possible is in portions of the landscape which are disjunct from the run of major cataclysmic fires, as we saw in 2019-20, which means playing smart with where you build your next generation of plantations, not through replacing existing native forests, but instead by finding areas of degraded land which are not subject to those run of fire, those landscape scale fire events. It is the only means by which you're going to be able to guarantee a secure resource into the future.
Thank you. May hand over to Mr. Veach, if I can, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. My question sort of moves on a bit from the plantation, the hardwood plantation question, but and I've got a number of them which I'll put on notice. But can I just ask each of the panel members, how do we, as policymakers, incentivise the participation of both the state and private operators into native hardwood plantation?
If I might jump in, it's a great question. Thank you. We think a lot about this. A 50-year investment horizon is very challenging. And I talk to a lot of the forestry industry and the supply chains and thinking about how you make that happen and how you make it appealing, not just for public investment, but private as the climate impacts worsen and people fear happening to their future hardwood plantations, what happened on Kangaroo Island, which shut down a lot of the industry, at least for some of the players. I think there are some key things. There's a lot of commonality in the foresters who are from the pro-native forest logging school and the plantation industry that Australia has not invested in the R&D around silviculture. We don't know how to grow well hardwood plantations over a half-century time frame that are going to provide the quality of wood for people's kitchens and floors that we can get out of native forests. So I think it's a basic R&D investment, and that would be one. I think when I talk to the plantation sector, they say that around at $30 a tonne for carbon, the plantation industry changes from being maybe not that economic in a lot of areas to economic if you can sell the wood and you attract carbon credits over a sufficient long lifespan. So I think the spot carbon price 2 weeks ago was $24 a tonne. It's heading northwards. So if you're going to make recommendations for what we do this decade, I think you should be trying to think where the carbon price will be at 2025 and 2030, and then talking to the people who model when hardwood plantations, particularly on the west of the divide, and then increase on the east of the divide, better quality soil, high rainfall, when that becomes economic, if you can attract a carbon price, and maybe some other co-benefits like Indigenous employment or grazing underneath with cattle. I think that's the way you've got to stack the long-term investment returns required with patient capital on top of the wood value that you sell, saw logs, carbon, hopefully water production as a natural drought assistance program because trees make rain, and other things, particularly benefits to farmers and Indigenous communities. And if we can stack those, particularly with natural capital markets, public and private blended, I think we're getting closer where plantations do make money, whereas in a lot of places they don't. That's why our national plantation estate has been shrinking.
Anyone else? Mr. Dunnett?
I think Virginia was about to speak.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I mean, we've had some experience of this in Queensland with a 25-year transition strategy implemented by the Beattie government. And then when governments changed, support for the program dissipated. So at that stage, that agreement was signed in 1999, I think it was. There was huge confidence in the timber industry that in fact you could grow a saw log in 18 years. And the 25-year transition was provided a really very significant buffer for the industry. The problem was political uncertainty. And so when governments changed, the management of the plantation estate changed. There are still some of those plans. I'm involved in a process with timber issues in Queensland right now. And so we're looking at what happened to the plantation estate. And there are lots of the plantations are usable for, well, they're all usable for something. It depends what product. But it does seem that it was, that very well-intentioned transition was a victim of political change and lack and variable management. So I think you do need a consistent and stable policy environment if you're going to do any kind of, longish term plantation establishment program, you need to have confidence that it's going to be well managed and it's going to actually deliver the wood that you're trying to secure. So right now, what we're faced with a bit of a crisis in Queensland as a result of that failure of, if you like, political will and management. And that may lead to quite, a much more sudden change now for the timber industry in Queensland than was once envisaged, because frankly, the wood's run out. A cup that was designed for a transition can't be sustained. So there's, you have to ensure that you've got a stable environment, I guess, for industry if you're going to go down this path. And I wouldn't rule out the fact that it is more than feasible for particularly some of the non-plantation players to simply change jobs. There are a lot of the smaller mills go to the wall over time anyway. It's far better to help people transition than just letting them die, which is quite a cruel fate, I think. So the transition that was designed in Queensland actually bought Boral's wood supply out and allocated it to the smaller mills. And then the Queensland government had first right of refusal over the wood supply for if the smaller mills wanted to sell. Now, there are all sorts of mechanisms that you can implement to deliver fairness to communities and particularly in some of the smaller towns where sometimes this stuff really does matter. So there are probably a lot of lessons out of Queensland actually that we could talk more about.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll offer, but I'm not offering as an economist or a resource economist of any sort of ilk. But what I would suggest is that at present, there's a presumption that there is access to a hardwood resource through the public native forests. We have a distortion in the market as a result of a forestry corporation that acts as both a regulator and as an asset holder, as a player in the industry. I guess the question we might ask ourselves is, if Forestry Corporation in fact was not the owner of the softwood resource, would there be an opportunity for the market to make a decision about whether those existing plantation areas are put to softwood or hardwood production? I understand that this is projecting forward into the future, but the reality is that we need to have a long-term view as part of this transition from a very unsustainable practice at the present.
Thank you. I think my time's up.
It is, Mr. Veach. I'll throw to Mr. Field.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your attendance today, everyone, and your submissions. Ms. Young, I might start with you, if I could. In the last session, or sorry, this morning's session with Timber New South Wales, there was some comments made about the nature of the science of forestry and the impacts of forestry on the environment. The suggestion was that most of the science around forestry is coming from North America and Europe and is not Australian based, and this is in regards to the environmental impacts of logging. Can you just speak to, I know we've spoken before about research in this space, can you just speak to the volume of science around the impacts of logging on Australian native forests that you're aware of?
Well, I think we've got actually far more comprehensive research in some areas than anywhere I've seen in Europe. I'm less familiar. I'm aware there is some good research in North America, but not normally by the forestry sector. So we're in the extraordinary situation of having in Victoria long-term monitoring plots set up in the Central Highlands and elsewhere in Victoria, and a researcher who has a breadth of knowledge across forest ecosystems and the biology of them. I would say he's a world leader, and that's Dr. David Lindenmayer. And I don't know whether he's going to appear before the committee, but his research is globally right at the very peak. So he's unquestionably one of the best forest ecologists and researchers in the world. So you know, I'm a bit mystified by those comments because that research is outstanding. The other area where Australian scientists have led, and this was a global first as well. There was a team at ANU led by Professor Brendan Mackey, who's now head of Griffith University's Climate Action Beacon, that which it was head of their climate change response program. I actually must declare I work on one of his research projects. So my work that I do on climate and biodiversity is actually a Griffith University project. But he was the first person to look at the sort of counterfactual. What happens if you don't log forests to the carbon? And the data that was gathered for that initial project, which included, I think, something like 400 plot sites of old growth data, which is really what you need to have if you're going to look at the carbon recovery potential in the forests. Now, that's the best data that anyone's been able to pull together globally. There are, you know, top-level peer-reviewed science papers that have got 20 plot sites, not 400. Now, that research was published in a Tier 1 peer-reviewed journal, the PNAS, in 2000 and when was it? Maybe 9, 10. It's not really ever been replicated in Australia, but what it indicated was just how far below the carbon potential our wood production forests are. And other science that's been done in North America, in particular by the Woods Hole and our Woodswell Institute for Research, Professor Bill Moomore, also looked at this issue and came to, quite independently, came to the same conclusion that there is much more carbon to be recovered if you let forests keep growing than from planting baby trees. And that's because people confuse sequestration rates, which are fast in baby trees, with the amount of carbon that trees can pull out of the atmosphere, which really actually depends on how big the tree is and how big the canopy is. So essentially, the bigger the tree, the more carbon there is stored in it, and the greater its sequestration potential in terms of the volume of carbon that they absorb from the atmosphere. So Stuart and others are right. We have a carbon gift horse sitting here that could help New South Wales meet its 2030 emissions reduction targets simply by transitioning rapidly out of native forest logging and focusing our attention on the plantation estate, which, as Stuart said, can be a carbon plus as well if you're planting additional trees. So, you know, this is just a no-brainer that the West Australian government seems to have thought about this in its recent decision, but even Western Australia hasn't really looked at the carbon benefit. The only state which coincidentally has benefited from a recent withdrawal of a large area of native forests from logging is Tasmania, who had a net 111% reduction in their state carbon accounts, thanks to withdrawing 170,000 hectares that got added to the World Heritage Area, and another, I think it was about 350,000 hectares that was put in under moratorium. They were the first state that didn't just reach net zero, they met minus 4%. And that's in the government accounts. That's in the state-based greenhouse gas accounts for everyone to see.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I've got quite limited time. I might just,
sorry.
Mr. You're right. That's valuable, but I will go to Mr. Blanche for a comment on that. But I just wanted to add something else. And again, I don't want to make it all oppositional, but I just think it was an important claim made this morning by Timber New South Wales. They said, what we shouldn't be, and this is a direct quote, what we shouldn't be doing is shutting down our native forests and basically letting them grow to a single-aged old age state, which benefits some species and not all. The science suggests sustainable managed native forest is best for the environment, best for carbon storage, best for climate change. Now, Ms. Young, I can see you've got some views on that, but I'm going to throw it to Mr.
Nonsense.
if I could.
Thank you. I rarely get in the way of Virginia in an argument about forests, so I'll do it only on Zoom. I will say two things. One is, for too long, the science around forests has been seen as forestry school science or ecological forestry science. And I can understand why people choose their particular scientist to quote. I'm a scientist by training, and I understand how that works. What I'd say is, you know, the declining koalas, the impact of the bushfires a year and a half ago, the community concern over forestry. You don't need to read a lot of scientific papers to see what's happening in our forests. And so evidence speaks to the impacts of how we treat our native forests if there's intense large-scale logging. That's one. Secondly, a report being produced for WWF, not by ourselves, but for us, looking at conversion of native forest in the New South Wales North Coast region to single species stands, particularly coastal blackbutt, Eucalyptus pullularis, because it grows quickly. It's not koala habitat. It won't be caught by the growing koala habitat protection laws that are coming. That's driven by the IFOA, the process that approved by government, overseen by Forestry Corporation, New South Wales. It's not making those forests more diverse, more species diverse. It's making them a monoculture because koalas don't eat them and they grow quickly and they make more money. So I would say at least around Coffs Harbour, Bellingen, Grafton, in those areas where the conversion continues apace, and we'll send this to the inquiry when we've finalised the report to us, it shows that the way that those forests are managed is not maintaining multiple age, multiple species, diverse forests. The opposite. The third thing I'd say about science on forestry is I'd agree with Timber New South Wales in the sense that we don't have a good idea of the tipping points in the forest that are increasingly coming. There's a lot of work done in the Amazon that shows that the combination of clearing, you know, and illegal and legal logging and fires means that the Amazon is tipping from something that stores carbon to something that releases carbon and reduces rainfall. So all the agriculture, the farmers, the loggers who benefit from healthy Amazonian rainforest, if they're managing it sustainably, are disbenefiting. And my fear is that Professor Will Stephan is right. When he's from the Climate Council, he says, we're going to lose our East Coast eucalypt forest because of climate change, irrespective of how they're managed. That might be a glass half empty view. I'm not seeing the science he's produced on it, but I think Timber New South Wales and the forestry researchers who perhaps hark back to a day where they had more access to state forests and not looking forward to the future when we'll be doing very well to hold on to any of our forests if we get to 2 degrees warming. That needs to be the focus, I think, of the inquiry is what do we do with our forest and our forestry industry when we have more of those terrible forest fires more frequently. It's an academic point then about how many scientists are saying logging is good for the forest or bad forest. We'll be doing very well to hold on to any of our forests this century the way the climate's heating. And that really, I think, needs to be a high priority for the inquiry to consider, even if very daunting to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Bunch. My time's expired. I'm sorry, Mr. Dunnett. I didn't get there.
Thank you. I just might start with you, Dr. Bunch. In your submission, on page 4, you have a set of sort of 10 outcomes, and number 7, which is about the expansion of protected areas of state through transferring all state forests to management by New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Services. That sort of seems to directly contradict with outcome 1, where you're talking about a fair transition out of native forest logging and moving into plantation-based timber, given that we have a significant proportion of our state forests that are actually softwood plantation. So I just wanted to offer you an opportunity to clarify what seems to be a bit of a contradiction. When you say all state forests, are you talking about all native state forests?
So thank you, Mr. Benasek. Yes, sorry, I assume that was, I meant all state forests that are native forests that are being used for logging. Sorry, I use shorthand.
Yep.
Sorry,
No.
my dog doesn't like our postman. I think there's, and I guess since we submitted those comments in June and following further discussions, I think there are 3 future scenarios for our state forests, and it's a competition, to be frankly, between them. Who gets to manage our state forests in the future? Is it the traditional route, handing over to National Parks and Wildlife Service? I've worked a bit with National Parks and Wildlife Service. They never have enough money to adequately restore and manage all their forests. So I don't think that should always automatically be the best option. And a lot of the forests need a lot of restoration, and they don't have the budget. And they can't get philanthropic funds like NGOs or Indigenous organisations to restore the forest. Secondly, I think it's really important that we give land back to the Aboriginal people who were kicked out of their forest, couldn't use them for economic value and cultural value, and they want their forest back. And I think it's practical reconciliation. And in areas where there's not native title outcomes potential, whether the land is handed to national parks, but then leased to Indigenous organisations to restore it and manage, because then they can go to other funding sources that the National Parks Agency cannot get to help manage it and create jobs, get people in the forest, managing the fire load, shooting feral pigs and deer, doing cool season burns, cultural burns. That's really important, keeping fire trails open, maintaining access, helping make a carbon economy. That's the second option. The third one, I think, is increasingly, can corporates or NGOs manage those forests, whether they own the land or there's a lease arrangement, to manage, get as much carbon into that land and produce as much rain? I think it's fascinating. And I wonder if it's some of the big banks, the big people with carbon offsets, the big multi-billion-dollar national or global companies that might have forestry as well, like in plantations, and they want to restore forest. A good example is Foraco down in Tasmania. They've got, I don't know, 77,000 hectares of native forest. They don't log anymore. And they've got a lot more in plantations that they do log. And on their balance sheet, they've got numbers against both their plantation estate, which produces wood and stores carbon, and in their native forest, which they manage, they have natural capital accounts that show how they're managing and growing carbon and wildlife and ecotourism and making rain for the people downstream. And I think we'll see more of that in the future. And I just caution, it can't just be government being the one that automatically gets the state forest. There's increasingly, they'll all be handed over to somebody.
Yeah, can I just try to pick up on another point where you talk about transparency, and you say on transparency on all explicit and hidden subsidies. I just wanted to pick your brain in terms of what subsidies do you think are hidden or are not fully transparent, and if you've got some examples.
Okay, I'm not the best people to speak on that. Others might have been who talked this morning, or Virginia and Garrett, or Gary. I think how much a taxpayer provides when Forestry Corporation needs to provide more wood supply because logging contractors cannot get access, like after fires. That's one. The cost to water supplies from erosion and eroding, particularly on very steep slopes, that's significant. That cost is borne by somebody. The biggest one is not allowing forests to grow into 300 or 400-year-old forests. There's an opportunity cost in foregone carbon storage, which we need. We all need that. Taxpayers in New South Wales need that to get to net zero and steep cuts by 2030. So when we log them,
that cost is never covered. It's never considered.
It's not covered.
It's never ever considered, and nor is, and this is a relatively new thing, so you can't be too critical about it, is the increasing evidence of increased fire severity and risk associated with logging, directly associated with logging. Now that's a huge cost to the community, and it will get worse. So these are some of the things that aren't even necessarily considered as costs at this juncture.
Can I just pick up on costs, Doctor? You were talking about, you know, sometimes national parks may not be the best person to management, or, you know, private sector investment in management, or handing it to the Aboriginal people to manage it in a traditional way. We heard evidence this morning that in terms of cost per hectare, national parks was, I think, around $125 per hectare, whereas state forest presently is $9 per hectare, and some of that they seem to attribute to, I guess, more allowable activities in state forests versus national parks. And given your statement, do you think it's perhaps, you know, with the current cost figures there, do you think it's probably best that national parks maybe do not manage an increased expansion of forests if their cost is so demonstrably higher than what it is with state forests? You know, obviously without some significant changes, it would seem that it's uneconomical. I think you're just on mute, Doctor.
Sorry, clearly I didn't get a PhD in using Zoom. I think the key thing is, I'm rapidly going. I think the key issue is, what is it, if for the money that goes from the taxpayers to support the logging industry, public and not public subsidies, what's the best use of that money? I want more money to go to forest industries, timber communities and forests. I don't want less, I want more, but they should be transparent, and we shouldn't just assume that just because we've done something in the past, we should keep doing it. So I don't think we should consider just keep doing native forest logging because we've always done it, or when we phase out native forest logging, give it to national parks. I think we have to innovate, because a lot of those forests will need a lot of restoration, and the National Parks and Wildlife Service, it's not their expertise.
Yeah. Could I also add to that?
Inputs.
Sorry, Stuart.
Sorry.
Could I also add, I mean, I did work for the National Parks and Wildlife Service for a quarter century and had some involvement in the cost planning at the statewide level. I'd suggest really strong caution about that $115 a hectare figure. It's worth remembering that while there's national parks and other reserves comprise about 7 million hectares across New South Wales, the vast majority of those funds is spent in a relative handful of high visitation reserves, particularly around metropolitan Sydney, so places like Royal, Ku-ring-gai Chase, Blue Mountains, Garrigal Lane Cove, those intensive urban reserves. And in fact, the cost of the, if you like, the wilderness and the forest parks is vastly lower than that, because in those places, you're talking about fire trail maintenance, you're talking about edge maintenance, in other words, fencing, and you're talking about pest and fire management programs, all of which should be occurring irrespective of what category of Crown land we're talking about. So I would have no confidence at all in the figures you've been quoted as a point of comparison between what it would require for the state to appropriately manage those lands if in one of the categories under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, as opposed to state forests.
Thank you. I will foreshadow, my time has expired, but I will foreshadow that I'll probably have some supplementary questions to you, Mr. Dunnett, on some of those figures and try and get a bit more clarity. I will now throw to Mr. Farraway.
I don't have any questions, so I'll throw to one of my colleagues, Mr. Martin or Mr. Poulos. Got questions?
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to step in. Dr. Blanche, just a question to you. I'm interested if you could perhaps unpack some of your observations in terms of how you could see our review into the industry and the role it could play in terms of perhaps accelerating our pathway towards net zero. I think there's a clearer objective in terms of the challenges that the environment and our climate faces, that perhaps the industry could see itself as a role model in this regard. Any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Poulos. I must say, after I saw the reactions from the West Australian loggers around Manjimup and Nanup in southwest WA a couple of weeks ago, how many people said they never saw this coming? There's been no consultation. It caught them completely unawares. And I've talked to people who are involved in government and the industry who've been consulting for years on this. And I think it's unfair not to foreshadow an intention. This is the pathway we're going. So if the inquiry said, we think there should be a planned, well consulted, very, very well funded process to transition out of native forest logging, or industrial scale native forest logging. There might be small scale that's still very sustainable. I think that's really important because it helps give people time to prepare. We shouldn't just drop an announcement on people. They're often just doing their job. They're out in the bush a lot and they don't get time to read all the newspapers and go to meetings. It's not fair to have a really disruptive, to them sudden ending of their industry. That's not fair. And I think if the inquiry were to say, well, we think on balance we need that transition and it's got to be fair and we have to consult. I think one thing that would be good is if, and I went through the whole reform of the Murray-Darling Basin and water, and it was very, very hard. But we all used to meet and talk together regularly because governments made that consultation happen, and it was painful, but we understood what each other thought. We don't have that in the logging versus non-logging debate now. There's not a process for that, and a process where people have to come together and try to work out a way to get to an end that government says that's where we're going. I think that would be really useful, and it might save people being caught unawares in the years ahead when a future government inevitably will have to say, we have to save our forests for our carbon accounts, not to log it. And then we need to grow a plantation industry. Can't wait for 10 years and then decide, oh, now we should expand our plantations. We can't wait that long.
Thank you. Did any of the other witnesses wish to provide any input?
I think there's probably more to unpack here again than we've got time for, but the financial benefit to the state of allowing forests to regrow and the impact that would have on the state's 2030 commitments is very substantial and should provide an avenue to help transition industry and workers really quite quickly and perhaps exit somewhere. Some people may be happy to go. So there is a broader discussion that needs to happen. There are, it's not a one size fits all kind of problem, I don't think, and having a genuine dialogue, which I have been part of in Queensland and I am again. And also I can recall meeting with timber workers and millers in East Gippsland many years ago, and a lot of them were really looking for an alternative to a very uncertain, high-risk industry where wood supply was declining and not finding the sort of support they wanted for their families and children to actually change jobs. So I think there's a lot of things that could be unpacked here if you did set up a dialogue that was perhaps less dominated by that actually created a space, I suppose, for some of the smaller players in the industry, because the bigger players tend to dominate and they have their own economic agendas that don't always well match and align with some of the smaller mills and smaller players in the sector. So I think that's just another thing to bear in mind. But carbon should open up an economic pathway for the state to be able to afford to do much more. This is a relatively inexpensive way of making a significant contribution to the state's greenhouse gas accounts.
Yeah. If I could also add, this is, if we're talking about a future transition of workforce and workers from one industry into other forms of land management, this is hardly the first time this has happened.
That's exactly right.
As I said before, I've had a long career in national parks, and some of the very best park workers I worked with were formerly forestry workers. And a big part of the reason for that is that there is a core set of skills that go with land management, irrespective of whether the ultimate goal of that land management is purely for conservation outcomes or for multiple uses. So it goes back to those issues of pest management, fire management, basic infrastructure. And so by signalling intent and providing a credible pathway, we are actually assisting those communities in thinking about what that public estate is going to require in terms of a workforce and what their role might be.
It's a very good point, Gary.
Thanks, Chair.
Any other questions from the government? No? Okay. Well, with that in mind, that concludes the questioning of.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes.
Is it possible to have some of that time that's left remaining transferred to other members?
That's not how we've done it with the other committees, though.
We've asked these witnesses to come along to the inquiry. We've got a few minutes left. If people aren't happy to have that situation, I understand, Chair.
Yeah, I would probably have to look to convention and say that it hasn't been done in the past. And given that we're only talking about 4 minutes, I would suggest that we put those questions as supplementary questions. I don't think we'll be able to equitably distribute 4 minutes, to be fair. So I thank all witnesses for coming and giving their submission and giving us evidence. I believe some questions may have been taken on notice. I do foreshadow some supplementary questions. I don't think 45 minutes is enough time to scratch the surface on this issue. So yeah, I foreshadow that there might be quite a few supplementary questions coming to you all. But once again, thank you for your time. So that concludes today's hearing. I will ask that the committee just remain on. I think there was a document that was tabled by Ms. Young that we need to discuss. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well. Thank you.
Cheers.
Excellent. I believe we are off live now.